I was 40 years younger and setting type by lamplight the morning Della Carver walked into my shop with a deed to her own ranch she had never once signed. She laid it flat on my composing stone, smoothed it with the side of her hand the way you'd gentle a horse, and said, "Harlan, somebody means to take the anvil out from under me. And by the look of this paper, they've near done it already." I wiped the ink off my fingers and read it twice. It was a fine, lawyerly thing, a transfer of the Anvil Ranch and all its water rights to the Spring Coulee Stockmen's Trust, dated the previous fall, witnessed and stamped and sealed like scripture. And down at the bottom was Della's name in a hand so smooth and curling it might have been copied off a wedding invitation. Della Carver had buried a husband and dug post holes in frozen ground and could rope a steer drier-eyed than most men. She did not write her name in curls. She wrote it like she did everything, plain, hard, and meaning it. "That's not your signing," I said. "No," she said, "it is not." I had run the Spring Coulee Clarion for 11 years by then, and I knew the valley the way a man knows the inside of his own pockets. I knew the Blue Spring most of all. It came up cold and steady out of the rocks at the head of Della's land, and in a dry year, and that year was the driest anyone could recall, it was the only water in 40 miles you could count on. Every small outfit in the basin watered off the creek the Blue Spring fed. Whoever held that spring held the whole valley by the throat. And August Greer wanted to hold the whole valley by the throat. Greer ran the Stockmen's Trust the way a spider runs a web. He sat still in the big house above the crossing and let other men do his walking. He had cattle on 1,000 hills and a banker's smile, and a way of saying asterisk neighbor that made the hair stand up on your arms. The year the creeks went low, he'd offered to buy out the little outfits at a price that wasn't a price. It was a dare. Most had sold. The ones who hadn't found their fences cut and their wells fouled and their nerve worn down a night at a time. Della Carver was the last big stone in his shoe. She had the spring, and she would not sell, and now here was a piece of paper that said she already had. "Where'd you get it?" I asked. Royce Penhallow showed it to me yesterday, across his desk, smiling like he was doing me a kindness. She tapped the curled name with one blunt finger. "He says the original's filed at the territorial seat. He says I've 60 days to vacate or the trust will move the law against me. He says I should be grateful Mr. Greer is willing to let me keep my saddle and my clothes." Her jaw set. I let him talk himself out. Then I asked him for a copy. He didn't want to give it. I told him a court would wonder why a man wouldn't show a woman the deed to her own ground. So he gave it. That was Della all over. Most folks would have wept or shouted. She'd asked for a copy. "You'll fight it," I said. "With what? Penhallow's the only lawyer this side of the pass, and he's the man forged it. Judge Malden rides the circuit, and Malden and Greer share cigars." She looked at me, and for just a moment the steel in her went thin and I saw how tired she was under it. "I came to you because you print the truth, Harlan, or you used to, before Greer started buying half the advertisements in your paper." That landed where she meant it to. I'd gone soft. A man with a press and a family to feed learns to print the cattle prices and leave the rest alone. I looked at the forged deed, and I looked at Della Carver standing in my ink-smelling shop with nobody in the world to stand beside her, and I felt ashamed in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years. "Leave it with me," I said. "I'll see what I can find." What I found over the next week was fear. I asked questions a careful man doesn't ask. I asked the county clerk what was filed on the anvil and was told, very politely, that the records were in transit. I asked at the land office and got shown the door. I asked old Mose Tucker, who'd witnessed half the deeds in the valley over 30 years, whether he'd ever set his name to a transfer of the anvil, and Mose went white as flour and said he didn't recall and shut his gate. Somebody had been to see Mose first. And every man I asked looked over my shoulder before he answered, the way you look for weather. That's how it stood, Della alone, the valley afraid, the law in Greer's vest pocket, and 60 days running down like sand. The afternoon a stranger rode into Halloran's crossing on a played-out gray and asked the way to a livery and a meal. I remember him because he didn't fit. He wasn't a cowhand, and he wasn't a drummer, and he wasn't one of Greer's hard cases. He was lean and gray at the temples, with a quietness about him that filled a room more than noise would. He wore a gun the way a carpenter wears a hammer, like a tool he'd rather not need. When he came into the Clarion office to buy a back issue and read the Valley News, I watched him read it, and I watched him stop reading and go still over a column I'd run about the trust's land dealings, buried small on page 3 where I'd hoped Greer wouldn't notice it. "This Stockman's Trust," he said, not looking up. "They've been buying water." "Buying or taking?" He set the paper down. "What's your name, friend?" "Harlan Pike, I print this." "Silas Crane." He didn't offer a story to go with the name, and I didn't ask. But he stood there a long moment looking at the column about the trust, and his face had the look of a man reading a letter he'd gotten before. He found Della before I could tell her about him. The way she told it to me after, she was riding fence on the South Line 2 days later when she came on 3 of Greer's men cutting her wire, Tully and 2 others, bold as brass in daylight, because what was she going to do, a woman alone? She did the only thing a carver knows how to do, which is the wrong thing at the wrong time for the right reason. She rode straight at them and told them to get off her land. Tully laughed and took hold of her bridle. And a voice from the cottonwoods said, easy and cold, "Let go of the lady's horse." Silas Crane sat the gray in the shade with a rifle laid across his saddlebow, not pointed at anybody, just asterisk there. Della said the strange thing was how the men's faces changed, not at the rifle, she'd seen rifles, but at the quiet asterisk of him. Tully let go. He said something about how this wasn't Crane's fight, and Crane said, "It is now," and the 3 of them rolled up their wire cutters and rode off, looking back the way men do when they mean to remember you. Della was not a woman who took kindly to being rescued. She rode over to him with her chin up. "I'd have managed." "I expect you would have," Crane said, "managed to get yourself hurt." He looked at the cut fence. "The careful sabotage of it, this been going on long. All summer, wells fouled, fence down, a fire in my hay last month I couldn't prove was set." She studied him. "You're the stranger in town, Crane." "I am." "Why'd you stop?" He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Because I rode through a valley once that looked just like this one. A spring at the head of it, a big man down at the bottom of it wanting the water, and a paper nobody'd signed that said he already had it." He turned the gray. "I didn't stop that time. I've been sorry about it for 19 years. That was all he'd say of it then. But it was enough that Della, who trusted no one, rode home beside him. She brought him to me that evening, and the 3 of us sat in the back of the print shop with the lamp turned low, and I laid the forged deed on the table between us. Crane looked at it the way I'd seen a horse doctor look at a sick animal, slow, all over, missing nothing. "Penhallow drew this." "He showed it to me," Della said. "Drew it," Crane said. "Look here." He turned the lamp. "Whoever made this didn't trace your name off a real one. He invented it. A man tracing keeps the shake in the line, the little hitches where the pen lifts. This is smooth as water. It's a clerk's hand pretending to be yours by a man who never saw you write." He sat back. "He got greedy and made it pretty. That's the first lie in it." I felt the breath go into me different than it had in a month. The first lie in it, as though there were a list and we might get to the end of the list. "There's a worse one," Crane said. "It says the original's filed at the seat. If it's filed, there's a recording date stamped on it by the land office, and a recording number, and a clerk who put it in the book. 3 things a forger can't make up out of his head because they all have to match what's already in the office ledgers." He looked at Della. "Did Penhallow ever say the asterisk number?" "No. He wouldn't, because it isn't filed. Because the second they file a false deed, there's a true record of a false thing, and that's a noose they don't want to hang over their own heads. They mean to scare you off the land before it ever has to be real. The paper's a bluff, Mrs. Carver. A loaded one. Malden'll honor it from the bench if it comes to that, and the trust'll have men on your spring before the ink's dry. But it's a bluff." He tapped the deed. And the way you call a bluff is you go get the asterisk true asterisk paper. The true paper, Della said. Your real deed. The one Tom filed when you proved up the anvil. It's at the territorial seat in the original entry book, with the original entry number and the original date, years before this thing claims you signed away the water. You put the true record next to the forgery, in front of somebody who isn't bought, and the whole thing falls down. He looked at me. And you put it in your newspaper, Pike, so that even Greer's bought judge can't pretend in the dark. I'll be honest. My first thought was of the advertisements I'd lose, and the window of my shop, and my wife and my boy. And then I looked at Della Carver, who had ridden at 3 armed men with her chin up, and I was ashamed of myself for the second time that month, which is twice more than I'd managed in years. I'll print it, I said. When you bring me the proof, I'll print every line. The seat was 4 days' ride over the pass. Greer's men were watching the anvil and watching the crossing, so we made a small lie of our own. Della let it be known she was riding to her late husband's people to ask for money to fight the trust in court, a thing that would have looked like surrender and would have made Greer glad. She rode out south, toward the rail spur, in plain sight. Then she cut east in the dark and met Sela's crane at the foot of the pass, and the two of them went over the mountains together for the books, and I stayed behind to keep the crossing thinking she'd gone the other way. I had the rest from Della, later. In the years we sat on her porch and she told me how it all went, until I knew it like I'd been there. They rode hard and spoke little the first day. Crane was a man who'd learned to keep his own counsel, and Della was not one to pry. But the second night, camped cold with no fire because a fire could be seen, she asked him the thing she'd been carrying. The valley that looked like this one, 19 years ago, what happened to it? He was a while answering. The mountains were black against the stars and the horses stamped, and finally he said, I wore a badge then, Deputy Marshal, territory south of here. There was a woman with a spring and a big man who wanted it, same as now. She came to me with a paper she said was forged, same as your deed. And I was a careful man with a good post and a wife at home, and I told her it was a matter for the courts, and I rode on. He stopped. Her name was Anne. The big man's hired men burned her out 3 weeks later to push her off. She didn't push. She stayed. She didn't get out in time. The wind moved over the rocks. I quit the badge after, he said. Couldn't wear it. A badge is supposed to mean a thing'll be put right, and I'd worn it and let a thing go wrong because it wasn't convenient to be brave. He looked at her across the dark. I've ridden a long time, Mrs. Carver, looking for the valley where I do it different. I think I found it. Della said she understood then why he was so quiet, and why his quiet was so heavy. A man carries that long enough, it presses the loudness right out of him. You couldn't have known she'd die, Della said. No, he said, but I could have believed her. That was the cheap part, and I didn't even do that. She didn't try to ease it. She just said, I believe you, about the deed being a bluff. So we're even, you believe me, I believe you. And in the dark she heard him almost laugh, the rusty sound of a thing not used in a long while. The seat was a mud street town with a stone records building, and there a careful man's whole plan can come apart, because the clerk at the entry books was a young fellow named Doyle who turned the color of ash when Della asked for the anvil entry. Somebody had been there ahead of them. Greer's reach was longer than the pass. Those records, Doyle said, not meeting her eye, are under review. Crane leaned on the counter, easy. Son, he said, I used to wear a badge in the South Territory. I know how a records office works. The entry book for the year the anvil was proved up is bound and numbered. You can't take a leaf out of a bound book without it showing. So either it's there and you'll show it to the lady, or it's been asterisk cut asterisk, and that's a federal crime, and the lady and I will be riding to the land commissioner with the empty binding as our evidence. He smiled, and it wasn't a warm thing. Which would you rather have happened on your watch? Doyle looked at them a long moment. He was young and afraid, and it turned out not yet bought all the way through. He licked his lips and said, Lo, there's a man named Penhallow been writing the office. Said the anvil entry was to be held back from anyone asking, said it came from high up. He swallowed. But it's there. I never cut it. I wouldn't. He went into the back and came out with the great bound book, and he turned it to the page. And there it was, Carver, Thomas and Della, the anvil, spring coulee, including the blue spring and all waters rising thereon, entered and numbered and dated 8 years before the forgery claimed she'd signed it all away. Crane had Doyle make 2 certified copies under the office seal, and had Doyle write out and sign a statement that Royce Penhallow had ordered the record suppressed, and paid him a fair fee for the copying, so it was all above board, and they rode for home with the true paper buttoned in an oilskin against Della's heart. But the suppression letter told them something cold. Greer knew they'd go for the record, and if he knew that, he wasn't waiting 60 days. He wasn't. While we were spread thin, Greer moved his men onto the anvil and his cattle onto the blue spring, and posted a notice on Della's own gate that the Stockmen's Trust now held the land per the recorded deed, and that any person remaining was a trespasser. He jumped the gun on his own bluff because he thought she'd never get the true record back in time, and a man on the ground with cattle on the water is a hard man to move, deed or no deed. Possession is 9 points, the old liars say, and Greer meant to make himself the 10th. They came back over the pass to find Tully's men camped at the Blue Spring, and Della Carver locked out of her own home. I will not pretend I was brave in what came next. I was scared the whole way through it, but Crane had told me before they rode the one thing that could break the thing open, and it was not a gun. It was the press. Greer's whole strength is that it happens in the dark, he'd said. Bought judge, bought clerk, men too scared to talk. The minute it's in the open, the minute every soul in the valley knows the deed's a forgery and the record's been hid, he can't use the law, because the law and the light won't carry a forgery, and he can't use his men, because shooting a widow off her land in front of 100 witnesses isn't business anymore. It's murder, and murder's the one thing a respectable man like August Greer can't afford. He'd looked at me. You print it, Pike, and you don't print it small on page 3. You print it big enough to read across a street. So while Della and Crane rode for the anvil, I set the most type I ever set in a single night. I set the forged deed and the true entry side by side. I set young Doyle's signed statement that Penhallow had ordered the record buried. I set most Tucker's gate slammed in my face and what that meant. And across the top, I set the largest letters my shop owned. A deed that never was, how the Stockmen's Trust forged a widow off her land. I printed every copy I had paper for, and at dawn, my boy and I tacked them to every post and door and watering trough in Halloran's Crossing, and I sent bundles out with the milk wagons to every small outfit in the basin. By mid-morning, the valley was reading. By noon, the valley was on the road. Because here is the thing about a conspiracy, the thing 19 years had taught Silas Crane, and one printed page taught the rest of us. It only works on people one at a time, alone in the dark, each one thinking he's the only one who knows and the only one afraid. The minute the small ranchers read that the trust would forge a deed, every man of them understood it could just as easy be asterisk his deed next. Greer had spent a dry summer teaching the whole valley to be afraid of him. He'd forgot that fear, printed up and handed around, turns to something else. It turns to a crowd. They came to the anvil, not a mob, a asterisk valley asterisk, with their families and their wagons and their newspapers folded in their fists. They came because Della Carver was the wall between them and Greer, and the paper had shown them so plain even a frightened man could see it. And there at the gate, with the true deed in her hand and her neighbors at her back, Della Carver faced down August Greer. He'd come himself this time in his good coat, with Penhallow at his elbow and Tully's men spread along the fence with rifles, and Malden the judge sweating in his buggy because somebody had told him there'd be land to settle, and he hadn't yet read the morning's news. Greer was still smiling when Della rode up. He thought it was a hand he held. "Mrs. Carver," he said, "you're trespassing on trust property." She didn't shout. She held up the oilskin and took out the certified entry and read it out loud, slow, in her plain, hard signing her name voice, so every soul in that crowd heard the true date and the true number and the true words, the blue spring and all waters rising thereon. Then she held up the forgery beside it. "And this," she said, "is what your lawyer drew to take it, recorded nowhere, numbered as nothing, signed in a hand that is not mine." She turned to the crowd, not to Greer, because she'd learned what Crane knew. The crowd was the court that mattered now. "He'd have done it to me alone in the dark. Read your papers. He'll do it to you." Malden had his answer ready before he'd thought it through. "The recorded deed stands until a court." "There is no recorded deed, Judge." Silas Crane stepped out from the crowd, and he had the young clerk Doyle with him, who'd ridden the whole way to say it to a judge's face. "It was never filed. The clerk who'd have filed it is standing right here, and he signed a statement that Penhallow ordered the true record hid. You honor this forgery from your bench today, Judge Malden, in front of all these people who can read, and you tie your name to a forgery forever. That's the choice in front of you. Choose it slow." I have thought many times since about what August Greer did then, because it was the whole conspiracy in a single minute. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the rifles along his fence. He looked at Malden, who would not meet his eye now, and at Penhallow, who had gone the color of his own forged paper. And August Greer was a businessman to the marrow, and he made the only sum a businessman makes. Cattle on a spring is worth money. A rope is not. He could not buy 100 witnesses, and he was far too respectable to shoot them, and the law he'd bought would not hold a forgery up in the light. He had built his whole web in the dark, and the dark was gone. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said to the crowd in that neighbor voice. "My agents exceeded his instructions. The trust withdraws any claim on the anvil." He turned his horse. He even, God help him, touched his hat to Della. "Mr. Penhallow and I will be discussing his employment." That's how it ended. Not with a shot. Crane never raised the rifle, and I have always believed he came home meaning never to, but with a man counting the cost in front of people he could no longer fool. Penhallow was disbarred and run out by the year's end. Doyle's statement and my newspaper went to the land commissioner, and the territory looked hard enough at the Stockmen's Trust that Greer sold off and moved south, where I expect he found another valley and another spring, but never again, I think, a dark one. Tully's men drifted. The blue spring ran on for everybody, the way it always had, because once it was Della's free and clear, she let every small outfit water off the creek the same as ever, which was the difference between her and Greer in one act, and the whole valley saw it. What I have left to tell is the part I came to know best, because it played out on a porch I sat on for 40 years. Silas Crane stayed. Not at once. He was a man who'd ridden so long he didn't rightly know how to stop. After the crowd went home, he made to drift again, the way he drifted into 100 valleys, and Della found him saddling the gray in her own barn at dusk. "You're leaving," she said. "It's done. You've got your land. You don't need a worn-out drifter underfoot." Della Carver, who never said a soft thing where a hard one would do, looked at that man who had carried a dead woman's name 19 years across 100 miles of mountains, and she did the bravest thing I ever knew her to do, braver than riding at armed men, because there's no fear like the fear of saying the true thing out loud. "I didn't need rescuing," she said. "I told you that the first day, and it was true. I had the proof in me to fight, and I'd have fought it alone if I had to, and don't you ever think otherwise." She put her hand flat on the gray's neck between him and the door. "But a body can want a thing it doesn't need. I'm not asking you to stay because I can't manage the anvil. I can. I'm asking because I'd rather not manage it alone the rest of my life, and because a man who'd ride 19 years to do a thing right is a man worth keeping by a fire." She lifted her chin the way she always did. "That's the offer, Silas Crane. Take it or ride. But no, it's an offer between equals and not a debt and not a rescue, and don't you dare make it small." He looked at her a long time, And Sila's crane, who'd believed 19 years that he'd used up his one chance to be brave, found there was one more in him after all. He took the saddle back off the gray. "I forgot how to stay," he said. "I'll teach you," said Della. "I'm a fair hand at stubborn." They were married that fall by a circuit preacher with the whole valley standing witness. A real signing this time, in Della's own plain hand, in front of more honest faces than any forger ever fooled. I gave the bride away, being the only man in the basin she'd allow the honor, and I cried, and I am not ashamed of it. I have said a great deal of type in my life. I have printed wars and weddings and the prices of beef. But the truest line I ever printed was the small one I ran the week after that wedding, down at the bottom of page 1 where the good news goes. The blue spring runs free, on the anvil where it always did. Long may it. Sila's and Della Carver Crane worked that ranch better than 40 years. They never had children of their own, but they took in 2 orphan boys off a broken wagon train one hard winter and raised them straight and let them go free into their own lives. And the boys came back every summer with families of their own to water their horses at the spring and sit on that porch. So the place was never quiet and never lonely. The fear that August Greer had farmed in the valley grew over with something better, the way a burned field comes back greener. And the spring ran cold and steady out of the rocks every dry year after, for everybody, the way Della had always meant it to. I asked Sila's once near the end, an old man on the porch with the spring sound coming up the coulee, whether he'd finally put down the thing he'd carried, the woman, the valley, the badge he'd taken off in shame. He looked out at the water a while. Then he said, "A man doesn't put a thing like that down, Harlan. He just gets to set it next to something good, and the two of them learn to keep the same fire." He reached over and took Della's hand, an old man's hand in an old woman's, both of them spotted and strong. "I didn't fix what I let go of all those years ago. You can't. But I got to be the man I should have been. Same valley, same spring, same big man and his paper." He smiled, the rusty old smile that came easier now. "Just a different ending. That's all a second chance is. The same story told brave. The spring runs there yet. I've outlived nearly everyone in this telling, and that is the hardest part of growing old, the way the people go and the land stays. But I rode up the coulee last spring, slow on a slow horse, and the water came up cold and steady out of the rocks the way it has every year of my long life, free for any thirsty thing that comes to it. And I thought of a widow who would not be moved, and a drifter who finally stayed, and a forged paper that a printed truth blew down like a house of cards. And I thought how the powerful men always reckon that the small and the scared will stay small and scared and alone in the dark. They are wrong more often than they know. All it takes is one person who won't sell, and one who won't look away, and a little ink in the light. Long may it run.